Greetings, I'm Mr. O'Neill, and I hope you're having a great day. I teach English language arts online for Stride K12, and I also coach chess as well as a few other esports. And we'll look at the teal bracket first, and then we'll get to the blue bracket. So for the teal bracket, it looks like Rift Bando made it into the quarterfinals, Dead Zone 222, King Saki XXIV, Admiral Aqua, Greek Geek 58, James 31, 7349, and Heston. All of those players who successfully made it into the quarterfinals, congratulations. And all of those players are usual suspects that we've analyzed before in previous videos, except for King Saki XXIV. I'm not sure if we've analyzed them before, but congratulations to everyone who made it into the quarterfinals. And as far as the blue bracket goes, I Rickrolled you made it into the quarterfinals as was expected. We also have a Piggy Bank 1391, Budgie 10, Cool 18 LP, the Chess Game FR, Trocador the Lemur Jedi, and Dream Angels 88. Congratulations to all of those in the blue bracket who made it into the quarterfinals. We'll go ahead and analyze a few of the games from the blue bracket while we're at it. Okay, so this first game that we'll analyze is between Budgie 10 and Anvoid 161. So Anvoid 161 starts off with a King's Opening, controlling the center right away with d4, and then not accepting the exchange but pushing to further control the center. Budgie 10 responds by putting their bishop on f5, makes sense. You don't want your bishop on b7 because then your bishop would be staring into its own pawns. So like for example, pawn to b6 and then put your bishop on b7 would be another usual spot to have your bishop, but then it's a pretty sad bishop because then your bishop's just staring at its own pawns. So nice active square for the bishop. And then we don't have an exchange yet. We have castles. Now we have the exchange takes. Budgie 10 still has their dark squared bishop, which is great because usually whatever color you have, the bishop that is your color is going to be stronger than the opposite colored bishop. So for example, white lost their light squared bishop and their dark squared bishop is usually a little weaker depending on the position. And then this dark squared bishop has a nice open diagonal. Whoops. This dark squared bishop has a nice open diagonal to get developed, or you can push and then have like a King's Indian style setup with this bishop, but then it would just be staring into this pawn structure, which is kind of sad. So probably want to develop this bishop on somewhere on this diagonal. And the knight gets into the game with f5. Okay, so the bishop develops to e7. The engine would have preferred to see a breakthrough right away with c5. And the idea is you're undermining white's pawn structure in the center right off the bat. Because if they take, then you can just retake with the bishop, and then you're developing your bishop and you're capturing back all at the same time. So you're kind of saving yourself a tempo by capturing with the bishop on c5, and you're undermining white's pawn structure as well. And you're also exchanging a c pawn for a d pawn. Because remember, pawns in the center are typically a little bit stronger and more important than outside pawns, or pawns on the b file, c file, f file, or g file. So if you're exchanging a c pawn for a d pawn, that's going to be good for black. So that's why the engine really likes black pushing right away. And attacking the knight right away, this is weakening the pawn structure for white. And not taking yet, we have castles. Takes. Now we have c5, and that's the top recommended engine move, which we had discussed c5 earlier. Takes. Bishop's on a more active square now. The bishop is harassing the queen a bit here, but Anvoid 161 does a good job of staying in the game, at least temporarily, until there's takes. You could also just take with the pawn. This is a little bit stronger, but Budgie 10 doesn't quite see it because it looks like you're losing a rook here, but the point is after takes, you've got takes. So you're hitting the queen, and then eventually you're going to win this knight back potentially. So the point is that you're threatening to take this, and you're also just pushing. So you're strengthening your pawn advantage in the center, and this knight hasn't been captured yet, but it really isn't doing anything because it's all the way off in the corner of the board. So it's almost like white doesn't have a knight. It's almost like white is down a knight here because their knight's all the way on a8, not doing anything. What happens in the game is takes with the knight, takes. The queen has to move to get out of the way of the rook, and then takes with check. Slide the king over. The rook is gonna move up to f6, which is a brilliant move, because after takes, the point is that you rook lifted, and now your rook is ready to deliver a checkmate to support the queen with a checkmate on g2. So the queen has to block the checkmate, and then we have check. And then the queen is sliding back to try to defend, but that's just checkmate because the queen's not being defended by an extra rook or an extra piece or anything. The engine says, just push your pawn forward like this, and black hasn't captured the knight yet, and white's winning by 3 points, which is a full minor piece, and black has lost their entire attack here. So this would have been quite the upset if Envoy 161 would have found pawn to f3 to block the check. And the point is that if you take the queen, you're still losing your own queen. And your rook is in danger of being captured, so like you got to maybe move the rook back. Or you can, like the engine says, you can threaten this, but then there's this. So this is just really difficult to play for black, and white's going to win here. But pawn to f3 was not found in the game, and they just slid their queen back, and that's checkmate. So that's the first game, and Budgie 10 advances on to the next round, the quarterfinals. We'll take a look at another game between I Rook Rolled You and Totally Not Jason Voorhees. And even though I Rook Rolled You is quite a bit higher rated in terms of chess.com elo, it should be mentioned here that Totally Not Jason Voorhees really stuck up a fight. This game went over 65 moves. It went, 61 moves. So not quite 65 moves, but it went quite a while. So I Rook Rolled You exchanges queens right off the bat, which is kind of unusual for I Rook Rolled You to exchange queens so early. But they're going to defend the pawn, and then they're going to reinforce the pawn in the center, and kicking the knight away. The knight has to go back to h6 because you don't want to lose your knight to the pawn on f6. So h6 is the only move here. Takes. I Rook Rolled You has successfully ruined black's pawn structure on the king side, and the bishop's going to develop. We have takes. Bishop is going to go after the knight to try to simplify the position a little bit. Takes. Now this pawn on e5 is isolated, so the rook's going to go after it. We'll reinforce the pawn with f4, but it also weakens the king side for white, and the knight's going to develop. King's going to move to a safer square. The engine thinks that's a good move. The knight's going to develop, so I Rook Rolled You finally develops their last minor piece. The rook is going to put itself on the same file as the king, so the king is in a little bit of danger here because of the pin, and as a result, we have bishop takes the pawn on h3, and the pawn cannot capture the bishop because of the pin, so the rook has to move to put an extra defender here on this pawn because there's a double attack on g2, and black moves the bishop back to safety. Takes, which is kind of a fork, but not really because the bishop's being developed, but the rook does have to move, and now we have takes the bishop, pawn takes, and now that pawn on e6 is isolated for black. The bishop is going to attack that isolated pawn on e6. The knight's going to go back to defend. Bishop's going to slide back because the bishop was being attacked by the rook. The bishop wasn't being attacked by the rook at first because rooks obviously can't jump over pieces, but as soon as the knight moves, there's a discovered attack against the bishop. So the bishop has to go back, and not only is the bishop getting out of the way of the rook's attack, but the bishop's also doing a nice job of defending c2. And there's 2 defenders on c2 now. So c2 is being over-defended, and their other rook's going to finally get in the game on d1. Nice open file for the other rook. And they're going to keep pushing the pawn here, which is the top engine move. And pushing the pawn again takes. So that's a discovered attack. As soon as this pawn takes, we have a discovered attack which they take advantage of. And then it's best to just retake right here. You're not in check. Just retake the bishop. And then you still lost material, a bishop for a rook, but at least it's not so bad because you've got a knight and a rook for 2 rooks. So at least you have some fighting chances. You're only down by 2 points in material if you're on black side here. But that's not what happened in the game. They decided not to take the bishop. I'm not sure why. And instead they just developed the knight to have a discovered attack against the bishop that way. So the bishop is just going to get out of the way of the attack. And that's kind of a fork, but not really, because the knight's being defended. So they're just going to take the undefended pawn. Takes. And now it's 2 rooks against 1 rook, and it's just a matter of time until I rook rolled you converts this. But it's going to take some work, because with black still having 1 rook on the board, it's going to take a little bit of work to convert this. So they go after a couple of other pawns. Check. Double up on the F file. Check. Could take the rook, but instead of capturing the rook and simplifying, they're just going to deliver another check. King's going to move. Check. Now you're going to take the rook. Takes. And now black only has a pawn left, and eventually they convert this into checkmate. So nice game from I rook rolled you, but the game lasted over 60 moves. So totally not Jason Voorhees. Really put up a really strong fight here. And congratulations to both players on a well-fought game. And we'll take a look at the next one between the chess game FR and Vincent JK 2011. So we have a King's Opening from Vincent JK 2011 and d5, which is pretty normal when you see this e6 move so early in the game. You're going to see d5 eventually to try to apply some pressure here. And takes, check. The issue is that you could take with knight. Taking this way puts some pressure on the bishop, and the bishop can't actually take the pawn here because white is attacking the pawn twice, but black is also defending twice. So since black is defending the same number of times that white is attacking, you cannot capture because then you're losing material. So white has to move. Check. Going to defend the bishop. Instead of capturing, they're going to try to recapture with the pawn to open up this file for the rook. So nice move from Vincent JK 2011 to apply some pressure on the knight. So that is a pin. The knight's pinned against the queen. Takes. Probably could have taken with the pawn here, and the engine actually really likes taking with the pawn because then you're opening up your rook on the A file. But they take with the knight instead, and then they're going to attack the bishop. Bishop goes to f6, so the rook has to move. Queen is going to apply some extra pressure, so black is getting pinned 2 different ways. And then kicking the knight away. Knight has to move. Knight has to move again because the knight was being attacked again. And yeah, so the knight was attacking this undefended c5 pawn. The queen has to move to defend this undefended pawn, but also simultaneously attacking b2. So nice move from a human perspective to not only defend the undefended c5 pawn, but also to attack the undefended b2 pawn. But the queen's a little bit overworked here. And the engine doesn't actually like that move. The engine would prefer to go here. This is more of a centralizing square for the queen. and you're attacking. You're keeping an eye on the knight, which is being defended, but you're also defending your undefended c5 pawn. So that's what the engine would prefer. But what happens in the game is queen to b6 and just developing a knight. Yeah, now you're losing a bishop, but you can recapture with check, but then the queen's also still covering, so you lost the exchange there because black was covering f6 twice and you were only hitting f6 once. So you lost a full minor piece in that exchange. So now black is happy to exchange as much as possible to try to get a winning endgame and pushing the knight out of the way. And now you're sacrificing a knight for a pawn. The queen has to move out of the way of the rook's attack. King has to move out of the way of the rook's X-ray vision. And the engine thought that was a good move. So the queen's doing a nice job of infiltrating with black, and the engine likes this move. And you're applying some extra pressure against the knight. You also have a pin against the king, and the rook is hitting this way. And you could potentially look at a rook lift and then sliding this rook over to double up on the e-file if you have enough time. But black just wants to trade the queens off the board and get to a winning endgame, since black is already winning by 6 points. So check. The queen is blocking the check and being defended by the knight, but the problem is it's a blunder. And Vincent JK 2011 is, even though they're down by 6 points, they immediately can get back into the game because of check. The king has to move, or you can take with the bishop, but then now your own queen's not being defended anymore. So since you had to deal with the check, now you're losing your queen. And then Vincent JK 2011 is winning by a point, and they're back in the game. So they've got a queen and a rook for 2 rooks and a bishop. So the queen and the rook is probably going to win this. And the engine says white is almost +6 here. Even though the material is only +1, the engine evaluation is almost +6. So unfortunately for Vincent JK 2011, they did not find this rook sacrifice in the game, and they ended up just going pawn to c4 anyway. And so the queen has to move. You could also take en passant here, but if you take en passant, then you run into the same problem we saw earlier where the rook can sacrifice and then the queen's not being defended anymore. So yeah, queen's got to go back. Rook's going to get into the game. Now they're offering a queen trade. Takes. That's a forking these 2 pawns. The rook is going to choose to defend the e-pawn. So we have takes. Going after the knight, takes. That's another undefended pawn. They're going to push the pawn, takes. And now white is really down a lot of material, down by 8 points, which is almost a full queen because the queen's 9 points. So white is almost down by a full queen. And there's takes. And white doesn't have any major or minor pieces left in the game. And it's pretty straightforward from here. The chess game FR eventually converts this into a checkmate. So nice game, nice win for the chess game FR, and they advance to the next round. And Vincent JK 2011, well-fought game. You had some chances. You had a winning idea that was just missed, and good luck next year. Okay, so we've got a couple of more games to look at. The next one is between Trocador, the Lemur Jedi, and Ironbat 7, and we have a King's Opening. The knights are going to get developed right off the bat for both players as well as the bishops. So we have a 4 knights game, and castles. The knight's going to hop into d4. Takes. You could also probably take with the pawn. It's not quite as good because you're weakening your pawn structure in the center a little bit, and then white can just hop their knight in. But so like if you try to hop your knight in this way, then you can take, and then that's a even position. You could also hop your knight in this way, ignore the trade for now, and go after the knight this way, but then you got takes, and then this is still a fairly even position for the most part. I mean, white is maybe slightly for choice, but it'd be difficult for white to convert this to a winning endgame just from this position. So what happened in the game is we had takes, bishop takes, not pawn takes. So the pawn structure is a little bit better for black here. And then the queen's going to slide over, reinforcing the center. Bishop's going to develop, takes, takes. And you're damaging black's pawn structure a little bit on the queen side, but the point is that your rook is on more of a semi-open file now. So the knight's going to hop into d5, and we have bishop develops to e6, which makes sense to reinforce the center. Take with check. The queen has to take. You don't want to take with the pawn because then you're damaging your pawn structure on the king side. And then takes, takes. You could probably take with the pawn as well. And then you've got a battery for the rook and the queen against this pawn. But it's really difficult to do anything with this battery right off the bat because this pawn on f2 is being defended by 3 pieces. 1, 2, 3. And you're only attacking it with 2 pieces. So you would really need to have 4 attackers on that f2 pawn to be able to actually capture it. So you're a long ways off from having 4 attackers. So the engine still thinks this is playable for black, 50-50. Maybe white is very slightly for choice, 0.2, but even position. So you could really take either way. So taking with the queen is what happens in the game, and then the engine thinks that's the best move anyway because you're keeping your pawn structure more intact. And pawn's going to move forward. That's a good move. And that pawn on b6 is undefended, but white doesn't really have a good way to attack it right away. So they're going to advance it anyway. They're going to close the position off, which is a good move because the point is if you take, then you've got takes and the queen's going to centralize. And these rooks are staring at each other, but it's okay because you've got takes, takes, and black's pawn structure is weakened on the queen side, but it's difficult for white to take advantage of black's weakened pawn structure. So according to the engine, if black plays correctly, they can hold on to this position even with a weak pawn structure, but this would be difficult for a human to play with these doubled pawns on the b file. So what's going to happen in the game is instead of capturing, they just push forward, and pushing forward again. This is a mistake because a6 is being defended twice by black and white's only defending once. So you've got takes, so you just lost a pawn. Ironbat 7 just gambited a pawn there. And takes, takes. Queen's going to develop. And here, black is going to slowly make some progress. Takes, takes. Yeah, that pawn was also being undefended. But you're going after this pawn on g2, which is only being defended by the king now. So white has to move the rook to defend this pawn because you don't want to get checkmated. So you got to defend that pawn somehow. And then takes, takes, brilliant move, because if you take the rook, which is undefended, then now you're getting checkmated because now the g2 pawn's not being defended by anything except for the king, and the rook is supporting the queen from behind. So brilliant move to take the pawn on a5. The rook can't actually capture the other rook. So check. King has to move. The queen's going to slide back to add an extra defender here. And then takes, takes, takes. Again, you can't actually take the queen because of the pin. So this nasty pin is showing its colors. And white cannot actually move the king because of the pin. So I'm going to go after the queen this way. Check. Block the check. Takes. King has to move because it's just to get out of the rook's pin. That rook's pin was nasty. Check. King goes back to h1, a little bit safer square. Check. King goes back. Offering a queen trade now. White declines the queen trade, takes, takes, and then if black could ever get a queen trade, they would win because they've got 2 pawns on the queen side that are getting very close to queening. So white is just going back and forth here, trying to stop these pawns from promoting. Black offers a queen trade. White declines the queen trade because if you accept the queen trade right away, then black's going to get another queen. So check. The king has to come in to try to stop these pawns as well. So check. And these pawns are not far away from queening now. Now we have a queen. Check. King has to move to get out of check, but black has 2 queens, so it's just a matter of delivering checkmate with 2 queens. And we get very close to checkmate there. So 2 queens are better than 1, and black gets checkmate. Nice job for Trocador, the Lemur Jedi. Moving on to the second round, to the quarterfinals against, I'm not sure who their next opponent is, but they get a good win against Ironbat 7. And Ironbat 7 had some nice games for this season. So congratulations to Ironbat 7 on putting together a nice season. Okay, so the last game that we'll analyze is between Dream Angels 88 and Kaismar. So Dream Angels 88 actually won the first game. Kaismar won the second game. So this is game 3, and this is for all the marbles on who is going to advance to the quarterfinals into the next round. So we have a Queen's opening for Dream Angels 88, and we have Kaismar responding with a Queen's opening as well. The Knights and the Bishops develop. Of course, this Knight wants to put some pressure on C7, also supported by the Bishop on this diagonal to go after this pin, the fork. So if the Knight could capture, then we have a fork, forking the king and the rook, but nice move from Kaismar. This is the only winning move to defend the pawn from behind with Knight to A6. And it's not really possible for white to dislodge this knight on A6. I mean, you'd really like to dislodge that knight so that you could get your fork, but the pawn's going to move, and then the queen is going to support the knight, but that is a sacrifice. So here, the best move is to take. So if you're Kaismar, you want to take, and then you can take with check. And Kaismar, you're winning this position by 2 points now, sacrificing a pawn for a minor piece. And you would probably be able to convert this into a win if you could hold on to this 2-point advantage throughout the rest of the game. But that's not what happens in the game. What happens in the game is knight's going to move over to h5 to put some pressure on the bishop. Bishop goes back, and then bishop's going to develop to e7. Again, this knight is not being... this knight is being defended by the queen, and it looks scary because the queen is going to recapture the pawn with check, but you're winning a minor piece in exchange for a pawn, so this would be winning. And the engine also says you can start with taking here first, and then white has to take back, and then now you take, and then take. And then this is just really good for black. So what happens in the game is bishop develops. Bishop's going to hop in, castles. Not sure why you're castling here. Again, you could take. You're going to take with check. You can defend the check this way. The queen's not being defended. Queen's not being defended. So maybe takes, 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 takes. And then after all that, you're still winning by 2 points. So you're still winning by that minor piece. So again, that's another variation that you had that would have gotten you the win, Kaismar. But we have castles instead, and then the queen's going to slide over to a3 and to support that bishop. So now we have, I'm not sure why Dream Angels 88 is going f3 here, because what you would normally want to do is takes, 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 and now you have to get your knight out of the way either by going back to a3 or hopping into d6, but your knight's being attacked, so get your knight out of the way, and this is still an even position. So again, you had some chances here. So what happens in the game is pawn moves up to f3, not sure. Again, these pieces are not developed. You want to develop your knight and your bishop, and these are undeveloped minor pieces. So now we have takes, 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 and then the queen has to move out of the way. So Kaismar is +5 here. That's even better than the other variations we were looking at. And rook's going to lift to a7. This is a fork. So the knight has to move. Takes, takes. Now, but Kaismar's still winning by 3 points. So 3 points is a full minor piece. And castles queenside, we have opposite castles now. Takes, because that pawn was undefended. Queen's going to slide over to go after that undefended pawn, which they don't take. The king has to slide over to b1 to get out of the pin because the bishop had a nasty discovered check as soon as that rook moves. So the king's going to get out of the way of that discovered check. And now the bishop's going to, or the knight's going to go back to c7 to attack the bishop. So the bishop's going to go back. Now they have an extra attacker against this pawn. So you want to defend the pawn. Probably is better to defend this way. That's what the engine was suggesting. So takes, queen has to move, offering a rook exchange, going after the bishop. Bishop's got to go back. Now cutting off the bishop's defense of the rook. So takes, takes. Probably also could have just taken this way. Takes, takes. Queen goes back. Black is winning here by 3 points. So if you have a choice between taking a rook or a knight, take the rook. Take the piece that's more powerful. But instead, black decides to take the knight instead of the rook. So black lost the exchange by 2 points there. So now they're only winning by 1 point, not 3. This is basically an even position in terms of material. But black still has some initiative if they play correctly. And the rook's going to activate, but we can take the bishop now because of the pin. The pawn cannot take the rook back. So black has definitely lost their advantage here. They were winning the game by 5 points at one point, but now they're losing by 2 points. They cannot retake the rook because of the pin on the G file. So the pawn is going to go after this attack. White's going to defend by b3. Bishop has to slide back. The point is that you can't actually take still because of the pin. So the queen has to move. And the queen gets to a safe square. Now we have takes, takes. And this is a blunder for white because you're sacrificing the bishop for no real immediate advantage. And after takes, pawn's going to go to f5. Rook's going to lift to a6, but we have takes, takes, takes with the queen. And the queen and the rook cannot defend this because the knight's in the way. So the king has to move. Check, 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 checkmate. And Dream Angels 88 is able to come back and get the win, even though they were down by 5 points at one point. So that's why you never resign a game. And Kaismar, you did a great job, and it's a well-fought game, pretty evenly matched for the most part. Both players had chances to win. And good luck next year, Kaismar. And maybe we'll see you for some of the open, casual arenas later down the line before the school year ends. And Dream Angels 88, congratulations on the win. And good luck in the next round in the quarterfinals. And that'll do it for the round 1 analysis of the K12 Esports League for the Winter Playoffs 2026. And have a good rest of your day.